I think it's probably good to start the discussion with dispelling some misconceptions that people have. This is a hot button issue, and a terrifying one, and an exhilarating one all at once. And that's the idea of the afterlife. Now, the reason why there's misconceptions, because while people may debate as to whether or not Jews believe in afterlife or not, and this and that, that's a discussion. But either way, the way it's always presented as the afterlife. So it means like we have life, and this is life, and then there's something that may or may not come afterwards. It's like the after party, right? It's like, but this is life, right? This is central. I would say that model is imperfect. Because while Jews do believe that this is not the only life we have, we don't present this as being life and what comes afterwards being secondary to it. We actually look at the afterlife as life. And perhaps we could say we're right now in pre-life. The Talmud makes a very interesting comparison of this life as being a gestation to next life. Now, if you were to ask, if you could possibly conceive, pardon the pun, of a discussion that you would have with a child in utero, right? That's not really possible, but theoretically. And you would tell the child, okay, what do you imagine life's about? So they'd say, well, life, I'm in this, really comfortable place where I can move and stretch, and it's really wonderful, and I get my nourishment, and it's fantastic. This is life. And you say, well, what happens when you leave this life? Well, then you're dead, right? What happens when you're dead? You're dead. It was fun while it lasted. That's what they would say, because they cannot conceive of something grander or something else or something different or something beyond their existence in the present time. The Talmud compares that to our life here. As if the life that we have here today is merely just a preparation and a prelude to life itself. This is not life, and then there was a talk about afterlife. This is the gestational period where we're developing ourselves for life itself. Now, that's why it's not a perfect analogy, because just like a child in utero, what happens to them is very much consequential to what they're going to be like in life. So, for example, the mom is drinking alcohol. Well, that can impair the development of the child. Right? The mom is exposed to toxins, or is doing hard drugs, or like that. That's going to impact the child. So it's not like life for the child right now is inconsequential to what life is going to be when they get to real life. Indeed, everything that happens to them now goes into who they're going to be composed of, or what they're going to be composed of, what their situation, what their circumstances are going to be when they actually achieve life. But no one could argue and say that that is what it's all about. Similarly, in Judaism, we say that the life we have today is a preparation. It's a very consequential preparation, because the actions that we do today, if we smote the spiritual meth, so to speak, we're going to be severely impaired with regards to life itself. So the actions that we do today are impactful and are indeed very consequential. But no one is going to say that this is the only one they have. Now, to be clear, the Talmud makes it abundantly clear that indeed it goes through sources as to the existence of the afterlife. We just call it the afterlife, or I think we should probably call it by its correct term, the Olam Haba, which means the next world, not the afterworld. It's a different world, it's the next one. But it makes it very clear that indeed is the goal of life here, is to actually gain entrance to Olam Haba. That's the focus, that's the goal. Jews have a head start in this, because Jews at birth already have a portion of the world to come. They could lose it if they do certain things, or they have certain sins, or they develop certain heretical beliefs. Non-Jews as well can be granted entrance to Olam Haba as well if they're righteous. But the goal of a human here in this gestational world is to make it healthy and whole to Olam Haba. Now, as to the existence of Olam Haba from Jewish sources, the Talmud goes and brings about 25 different sources. It's an overwhelming amount of sources from the Torah itself that clearly point to the fact that the Torah believes in Olam Haba. Now, importantly, the Torah does not speak about it overtly. There's a reason for that. Every time the Torah talks about future predictions, projections, forecasting the future, it's always about life here. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is because the Torah does not want to take any shortcuts to greatness. We'll talk about how to get shortcuts in a little bit. There are some shortcuts. But the shortcuts are kind of really hard, so it all balances out. And you'll see what I mean in a little bit. But there's no shortcuts to greatness. If you want to become great, you're going to have to work. Clear and simple. Now, if I were to tell you, if you don't do the mitzvahs, if you don't observe the Shabbos, if you don't put on your tefillin every day, if you don't keep kosher, you, when you die, are going to be put in the fire of 1,000 suns. Right? Well, that's a shortcut to greatness. Because then you're like, oh, geez, I don't want to do that. I don't want to burn. Oh, okay, fine, I'll do it just to cover all bases, right? And that's a way a lot of other religions operate. Because if you want to gain mass traction, you don't want to have individual greatness. You just want to have huge numbers of adherents that aren't really believing in something, that's very developed, but it's a very primitive belief. But you want to gain large numbers of adherents. That's what you would do. You compel them, either by the damnation of the afterlife or by the sword of present life, like other religions have used. But that's an easy way to get someone to adopt your platform. The Torah doesn't want easy ways. The Torah wants us to achieve greatness on our own. Therefore, the Torah does not try to freak us out, like with every page talking about Olam Haba, even though it is hinted, throughout the Torah. It's ubiquitous, and indeed the Talmud goes and demonstrates again and again that the only way certain verses are understood is if Olam Haba exists. Now, that being said, I want to point out that it's logical as well, because if you believe in God, once that is established, you already have to believe in Olam Haba, because there can be no purpose here. Right? You look around the world, and we don't see purpose. Thus, it's only possible to believe, or better yet, if you already believe that God exists, then by definition you believe that there is purpose, and thus there must be some purpose, and we don't see it here, there must be some other arena where that purpose is visible or is displayed. So that's the idea of Olam Haba. Now, we look at other sources that make it clear that that's the goal of life. For example, Lutzato, Rav Moshe Chaim Lutzato, in his seminal work, Mesilat Yesharim, Way of the Just, he starts up the first line, what's the goal of life? Get Olam Haba.
This is that book from the 1700s or something?
Well, that's one of the books. There's The Way of God, which he talks about as well, but the Mesilat Yesharim is another one of his books, which is considered the foundational book of Musar, because he outlines that difficult path to greatness that we talked about.
This was written in the 1700s.
Yes,
right?
yes. But he calls it. That's right. The Italian moved to Israel at the age of 20. But he calls it from various Torah sources. It's abundantly clear. Now, I think there has been a disservice done to some Jews by telling them we don't believe in Olam Haba. There is this idea that we don't talk about it. We don't talk about Gehenna. We don't believe in hell. People are very hesitant to talk about it. If you look at the sources that predate any one of the squabbles that Jewish communities today engage in, it's abundantly clear and it's incontrovertible that Judaism believes in the afterlife, or what we call Olam Haba. It's abundantly clear, indeed, that's the purpose. So to say that is not true or whatever, we don't believe that, we don't talk about that, I think is a mistake. Now, so what's the relationship between this world and Olam Haba? So it's interesting because this world, like I said, is consequential because the activities that you do today here determine what you're going to look like in Olam Haba. That being said, this world is inconsequential because we don't look at this world for reward and punishment. We don't see reward and punishment in this world. And thus, the way these two worlds interrelate is that the activities you do today that you can only do here, those are accounted for in Olam Haba. And when you get to Olam Haba, you cannot do any more mitzvahs or any sins. Like your capacity to perform and produce is curtailed. This world is a world of production. That world is a world of consumption. That's why one mitzvah in this world is so precious, because once you're out of this world, once you're dead, you can't do any more mitzvahs. This is the only opportunity you got. And conversely, with regard to reward and punishment is only in Olam Haba. This world is no reward and punishment. Thus, the question of why bad things happen to good people, right? The core of the answer is because, bad things happen to good people, but that's not in the arena where the reward and punishment is amplified like it is in Olam Haba. Obviously, that's a separate discussion, but we could talk about that some other time. We have spoken about it here in the past as well. But that's the core of the answer. The core of the answer is that we tend to look at this as life. Thus, we want to see all accounts settled here. And we don't see all accounts settled here. Is it fair that some guy could kill 6 million Jews in the world's worst genocide and get away with a bullet shot to the head? Is that fair? Is that a settlement of all accounts? Of course not. No one's going to say that. How is that fair? Well, the answer is no. There is no fairness in this world. Right? Ultimately, the fairness exists with the balance of these two worlds.
Yeah, I had an interesting few years back when I was still working. We had an emergency room physician from Egypt, Muslim. We had he starts talking about Judaism, and he says, "How come you don't believe in a heaven and hell?" I said, "Well, and I said, geez, I have to look at it. It's kind of vague. We really don't talk much about it. It's kind of vague. He made such a big thing about it. So I looked it up, and it is vague.
Yes. Well, it's not vague, but people are hesitant to talk about it.
Yeah. But hell, they don't.
We don't talk about it because it's a very unpleasant and misunderstood topic. I think we should have a talk about it. Why not? Like, this is what we do, right? We tackle the challenging subjects and really address them from the bottom up.
I was reading the Seventh-day Adventists. They believe in heaven, and then they kill off all the rest. They call it abolitionism or something.
I know, but that was not mainstream stuff.
Oh, okay. That's what I read on Wikipedia.
I know. We talked about that. That's not mainstream Seventh-day Adventism.
When you're talking about no reward or punishment in this life, I was thinking, and maybe I don't understand how you use the terms, when they are, half the camp is on Mount Ebal and half the camp is on Mount Gerizim, and he says, if you do these things, these are the blessings. If you do these or don't do, these are the curses. Are we talking about different blessings and cursings? Is that different than rewards and punishment?
Yes, that'll be different rewards. Now, that being said, so just once you brought this up, to clarify, it is possible to receive reward for your mitzvahs here and punishment for your sins here. And like we said, it is possible, but that's not the ultimate. It's not where the reward and sin is amplified. Remember when I said that, right? So you don't want to cash in on your mitzvahs here and get paid in pesos when you could cash out in kilos of gold, right?
Yeah, gold.
That's right. Thank you, John. That's why, for example, if you look at Jacob. Jacob was terrified that he exhausted all his reward already. So he was worried when he was going to have this encounter with his brother, with Esav, that he's now going to be vulnerable because he has no more. Because so many good things happened to him, even though so many bad things happened to him as well. But so many good things happened to him that he had just exhausted it all. And that's a common refrain that the righteous have, is that they're wary of using up all their merits in this world. Either way, so Olam Haba is the goal. We can only get to it. The path that we use to get it is this world. And more specifically, the behavior, the activities that we do here, the mitzvahs, they are the ones that enable us to access Olam Haba. That's what the sources say. What I want to look at very critically is the three different methods that the mitzvahs bring us to Olam Haba. Because what I've found in my analysis is that the sources look at three different avenues towards getting Olam Haba. And
before you start
go ahead.
That, what happens if you don't do the mitzvahs? What happens if you are Hitler?
Yeah, so we're going to focus now on the positive side, but clearly, like we said, all accounts are settled in Olam Haba, and they're settled, and there's nothing left over. Means is that everything is made whole. So even if you're a sinner, but you do mitzvahs, everything is accounted for. And even if you're a righteous person and you sin, everything's accounted for. Where those things are accounted for, right, it depends on your level of piety. Because the righteous people want to have their sins accounted for here. And the wicked people end up getting their mitzvahs, their reward accounted for here. But everything is accounted for. And the Almighty has his ways to ensure that. And there are a lot of sources about that. We're going to look at kind of the positive side. How do we get Olam Haba via our actions here? And we find before us three paths. So we are familiar with the idea, we've spoken about this prior, that the mitzvahs correspond to the human body. We're told that there's 248 positive mitzvahs. When I say positive mitzvah, it means a mitzvah do X, Y, or Z, right? Sit in a sukkah, eat matzah, right? Etc. And then there's the negative mitzvah, which means refrain, withhold from doing X, Y, or Z, right? Don't eat non-kosher, for example. And 248 positive mitzvahs corresponding to 248 limbs that a person has, and 365 negative mitzvahs corresponding to 365 sinews, muscles, that keep the limbs intact. Now, obviously, from the fact that we're making a connection between the body and the mitzvahs, it's apparent that there's this completion, so to speak, that we gain, just like we have all 248 limbs. A healthy human body has all 248 limbs. A healthy spiritual entity has all 248 mitzvahs. And similarly, if you do all the mitzvahs, then you complete like a replica of yourself, an avatar of yourself, wherein there's a physical you, and now you created a spiritual you. And what happens when you die? So your physical 248 limbs and 365 sinews gets put in the ground and starts decomposing. So what's left of you? Well, what are you? You are the spiritual reality that you created, the spiritual body, even though that's apocryphal, right? That doesn't make any sense. But the spiritual body, so to speak, that you created is who you are. So you go to Olam Haba, it's a spiritual world. Well, what do you look like? You look like what you created. Thus, by performing all the mitzvahs, you are granted access as a spiritual human to Olam Haba. You do them all. This is the old mitzvah path. Path number one, the easiest path. Maybe it takes a few years to get there. But you do all the mitzvahs. You fulfill them all perfectly. Well, you fulfill them all. We'll get to perfectly in a second. You fulfill them all. And voila, you are now, on top of being merely a physical entity, you created a spiritual entity. Thus, in a spiritual world, you are complete. What happens if, unfortunately, you ignore one mitzvah? Some people like to say, listen, Rabbi, there's certain mitzvahs that resonate with me. This one I really like. Other ones, less so much. It's equivalent to someone to say, geez, I really like these fingers. But this one, do I use it so much? Can I live without it? Yeah, of course you could. Yeah. But would you give it up? We have to look at the mitzvahs as each one of them being important. And that's what the Talmud tells us, or the Mishnah tells us, that we have to pursue and chase and run after even a minor mitzvah. just like, you don't say, well, my left toe, my left ringed pinky toe, whatever it's called, that one, not so important, right? You can walk without it. Maybe it's a little uncomfortable. Not so important. Kneecaps. Is it so important? Could you live without kneecaps? Why, is it the end of the world? What do you mean? They have all the technology now. Still, we're very happy with our body as fully functioning, and we feel sad for the people that don't have what we have. And we wouldn't want to give that up for almost anything. Do you need both eyes? You can see well without eyes? Yeah, it's a little harder, right? But of course, we have someone in our neighborhood who lost the vision of one of his eyes in an accident. He sees fine. But do we want to put ourselves through that? Of course not. And that's why every mitzvah is important. We wouldn't, just the thought of taking the human body and removing one part of it is unthinkable to us. Like if I were to tell you, if I were to just ask you to imagine, or just to try to give me your understanding as to which one of them is more painful. Is it more painful to pry off a fingernail, or to gouge out one of your eyes, or to have one arm amputated? I know this is a little gory, but it's uncomfortable, right? Just that question was uncomfortable. Because to us, we cringe at the thought of taking any part of our body and removing it. Because it's all one entity. It's not like, we don't look at our finger, only in the context of the function that it gives us. It's part of who we are. We have to realize that we're creating in our life a spiritual replica of our body. And thus, every mitzvah is precious. It's all part of this collective that's us. And that, by the way, is going to last a lot longer than our spiritual body. Because every one of us knows here, this is a fact, that within 100 years, we'll say 110 years from now, maybe I can live to 140, maybe. I think I'm the youngest person in the room here. I'm 29, so maybe within 110 years, we're all dead. Everyone agrees. So our body's shelf life is 110 years. What's our soul body's shelf life? It's forever. Because the soul cannot be extinguished. It's a soul. It doesn't have this constraint of 70, 80, 100, 140 years.
What about when that soul reincarnates?
Reincarnates is you're just kicking the can down the road. Right? You're just going through this another 120 years. But either way, the point is the soul is still... The whole point of reincarnation is that, okay, you have one more shot to try to get to where you need to get to. But either way, the end goal is the same. Your soul is going to be around forever, and your body, whether or not you have the same body or you're reusing or you're being granted another body, it doesn't mean... It means it's also important to know, like the Almighty made our body in the manner where our cells regenerate. So we have cells that get old and rusty, and they get replaced with new, healthy cells. So our body is actually not the same body we've had since childhood. It's been replaced several times over. But we think of our body as our body hasn't changed, right? But the reality is, on a molecular level, it's an entirely different body. Entirely different. And by the way, what part of our body stays the same? The brain. Our brain cells don't regenerate. Which I think is the Almighty's way of saying your brain is the part of you that's most spiritual. Thus, that's not going to change. Everything else is, you can filter them out. It's like, yeah, we look at our spine and our ribs and our fingers, they're the same fingers we've had. No, they're actually not. You have to break down cell by cell. They're entirely new. They're 10 years old, max. But we're used to thinking in body-centric terms. Thus, we think of our body as being, it's been around as long as I've been around. No, it hasn't. It's brand new. So we're kind of going through this organic reincarnation all the time. Because a body is a body is a body. And that doesn't really matter. But our brain, which is most closely linked to our soul, that's there, and that's what we got, and that's permanent. So reincarnation, like I said, it just makes the 70 years into 140, 180 years. But either way, it's still, there's a shelf life.
So if I'm following your logic, then we are never going to really get to the afterlife of what you're talking
No, I'm not
about.
saying that. I'm saying reincarnation is the unfortunate. I don't want to talk about it too much because it's a little bit hard to source.
Yeah.
But reincarnation, all it does is gives you, it extends the life, so to speak, of your physical iteration.
Gives you a second chance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
you're going to reincarnate a zillion times.
who says that?
Are you suggesting we only incarnate one time?
Reincarnation in Judaism, like I said, the sources are scant, but what the sources do say is that it's not just perpetual reincarnation like the Hindus have. It's just, ideally, you want to finish it all in your first round, your first go-round. If there's some patches you need to fill, you may get another round.
I didn't appreciate that there was only 2 rounds.
Or 2 or 3 or 5. But the point is that you might get an additional round to fix what you need to do. But the goal is not to be here as a physical body. The goal is the spiritual, and thus, if we complete it in the first round, then that would be ideal.
But this is the
The sources are scant, but that is a clear, clearly what emerges from the sources. This idea. But either way, so the all mitzvahs path is taking the Almighty's instructions, fulfilling them over here. Via their fulfillment, we create a spiritual entity of ourselves that mirrors our body, but it's not physical, of course, it's spiritual. And thus, when our physical side is put aside, is interred, well, what goes on to the next world? Our spiritual entity, our spiritual reality. And thus, if we have it, we're great. If not, we're lacking. Now, there are some organs or limbs that you cannot live without them. And some, well, you could live, it might be uncomfortable living, but if someone, God forbid, has their arm amputated, so they lost a whole bunch of limbs, they can still live. So if we, let's say, ignore some mitzvahs, so it depends which mitzvahs are we ignoring. If we're ignoring mitzvahs that relate to our heart or our brain, well, then it's, we can't gain access to any life in Olam Haba because we're missing some of the engines that keep us alive, some of the limbs that give us life. As opposed to if we ignore mitzvahs that are less important, corresponding to less important aspects of our spiritual body, well, you'll still be alive, but you might be crippled or lame or missing or lacking. And that's unfortunate, but you could still have some sort of life in Olam Haba. And that's why we have some mitzvahs, for example, that we're told that if someone ignores those mitzvahs, for example, circumcision, right? Circumcision is a mitzvah that labels us as a Jew. So the Talmud says, the verse says, it's not the Talmud explains, but the verse says if someone doesn't fulfill that, they get cut off from the Jewish people, which means they lose the capacity to have continual existence beyond the physical life as a Jew. What it means is that they lose a mitzvah that corresponds to a spiritual limb that you need to live. Thus, if you don't have that mitzvah, you don't have that limb, that spiritual limb, and thus you cannot live. As opposed to other mitzvahs, they're still super important because we don't want to think of ourselves as just a collection of limbs that can be summarily removed at will, but we could still have some sort of life. But that's why we don't say, oh, let's focus just on the big things. No, we got to focus on them all. And of course, that's a process that may take years. Of course, that's a lifelong pursuit. Go ahead.
Is the avatar that we're creating, is it the same as the soul? Or is that a separate, are we talking about a separate?
Well, it's. I would say it's giving the soul life, or giving it the capacity to exist beyond here. It's very hard to talk about the soul in these terms. That's why I said it's like an analogy. So I'm saying it's hard to quantify it in physical terms, but that's the idea. The idea is we have a soul already here, so we're creating kind of a soulful body, which is the way I like to say it. But it doesn't, obviously, that doesn't work because a soul can have a body, but it's a soulful existence, spiritual limbs that give you existence in Olam Haba. That's the way I like to say it.
In the next
Yes.
We could be lame or...
Oh, yeah. That's unfortunate, right? And, yeah, because, and this is, by the way, to me, what this does to us is it really raises the value we have to give to mitzvahs. Because we think of mitzvahs as nice things to do. It's like a nice thing. Wouldn't that be nice to have a mitzvah? The Almighty's given us instructions, and so wonderful. But, what if something else may take priority? But you see the Jewish obsession with mitzvahs and dedication that we have to mitzvahs, and that's really because every single mitzvah is so precious because it's integral to who we are as a spiritual entity. And thus we don't have the liberty to say some mitzvahs are important and some mitzvahs are not so important. Everyone is so vital and so crucial and so necessary, yet unfortunately we tend to overlook them and say, well, it's not so important, which is dangerous because that's what's going to be Olam Haba. Olam Haba, we are the mitzvahs that we fulfilled.
So what happens to the 7 billion people who don't follow these?
Well, that's the nice thing about our religion is that we have this pluralistic idea where it's not, you don't have to be Jewish to be good. So if they fulfill their 7 mitzvahs, the 7 Noahide mitzvahs, they can have a portion of what to come as well. They're good people.
They will be equally bound by the mitzvahs that they do in this world, just as we would be bound by ours as well.
That's right, but the Jewish nation accepted upon themselves to become great. Thus, we have a much higher floor that we need to eclipse.
What about those people who have died that cannot complete mitzvahs that need to be performed in the land or without the temple?
Good question. So, what about the agricultural laws in Israel? What about the mitzvah, the sacrificial laws? So the Talmud tells us that if someone studies the laws of an Olah, it's as if they fulfilled the mitzvah of an Olah. What's an Olah? An Olah is a sacrifice. So the idea is there's ways to fill in those gaps in our spiritual avatar by studying the Torah that correlates to those mitzvahs. So I gave a talk called Filling in Our Spiritual Avatar, which I think it's what it's called, something like that, but which I talk about this subject at length, where the Torah study is so important because it enables us to do the things that we couldn't have done otherwise. There's mitzvahs that are not possible for us to fulfill. So are those spiritual limbs beyond us? Of course not, because the Torah enables us to fill in all those gaps. Torah study, which is why, one of the reasons why I said in the talk, why the Jews are so tenacious in Torah study, even with regards to mitzvahs they cannot fulfill. And I would say, in this context, those mitzvahs, the Torah study correlating to those mitzvahs are even more important because besides for the mitzvah of Torah study itself, they help us in our other pursuits as well. But good question. Okay, so that's so now we're a little bit depressed because, oh gosh, we got to do all the mitzvahs. We have to do all the mitzvahs, and there's so many mitzvahs, and where do we start? And it's many multi-year project, and we're doomed.
Do women have less mitzvahs?
Women, no. The mitzvahs are for everyone. Some mitzvahs we cannot fulfill. Some mitzvahs, for example, men cannot fulfill. Only women can fulfill. But men and women are both equally demanded from that they must achieve greatness. And the way they do it is by fulfilling Torah to the degree that they're able to study Torah, to teach Torah to their children, to support a wholesome Jewish living, and that's how both men and women achieve their greatness, by doing everything that's demanded from them. Okay, so the Talmud, I think, gives us a little bit of an opening. The Talmud tells us a few stories, very dramatic stories, in the book of Avodah Zarah. I'll go through them real quickly because there's a common theme in these stories. It's interesting, these stories. The punchline of the stories, I'll give you a spoiler alert. The punchline of these stories is 3 individuals that were able to achieve everything that we just outlined in 1 hour. And they are compared to the people who spent years and years and years filling in the spiritual avatar, making sure they have all the mitzvahs in place. These people, they got it in an hour. What are the stories? So story number one is there was a Caesar, one of the Roman Caesars, who hated the Jews. So the Talmud doesn't tell us which one it was, but if you learn history of the Jewish people at the time, it could have been almost any one of them. So he hated the Jews, and he's sitting and talking to his advisors, how do we get rid of the Jews? And he tells them, well, if you had a wart on your foot, would you cut it off or would you suffer your whole life? So they tell him, you got to cut it off. He's like, oh, the Jewish people, they're bothering me, they're thorn in my side, I'm just going to get rid of them. Everyone agrees, besides for one guy. Katia Bar Shalom gets up and says, wait a minute, what's going to happen? First of all, he brings some verse, he can't actually extinguish the Jewish people. We know we're an eternal nation, he can't get rid of us, number one. Number two, he says, what's going to be your legacy? You're going to be the Roman emperor who destroyed his own people, who killed his own subjects, who murdered his own citizens. You can't do that. So everyone says, okay, we can't kill the Jews, but the emperor says to Katia Bar Shalom, he says, you spoke valiant for the Jews, but you spoke up, you were chutzpahdik to the emperor, and thus we're going to execute you. And they lead him out to execution, and everyone's watching, and someone announces, one of the Roman matrons from the seats, from the crowd, they say, oh, you're going to go be killed for the Jewish people, but you didn't pay your tax. So she's insinuating, well, you're a non-Jew, and thus you gave up your life for the Jewish people, but you're not even part of the Jewish people. So what a waste. You didn't pay your tax. That's what she said. So as he's being led to execution, he takes some sort of device. It's not clear what kind of device he takes. And he circumcises himself. And he sees, see, now I paid my tax. And they take him and they execute him. And as he's being executed, he announces, I want all my possessions to go to Rabbi Akiva, who was obviously alive at the time, and his friends. And as he was executed, and there was a bat kol. A bat kol is a very low level of prophecy. The bat kol announces, Katia Bar Shalom, Mizumon L'chaya Olam Haba. Katia Bar Shalom, this individual, is ushered into Olam Haba. And when Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was going to be the future leader of the Jewish people, when he heard the story, he started to cry, and he said, some people acquire their world in 1 hour, and some people, they acquire the world over multiple years. That's story number one. Story number two, also a very dramatic story, is about a fellow by the name of Eliezer ben Durdai. Eliezer ben Durdai was a connoisseur of prostitutes. He had an insatiable lust. And every prostitute in the land he patronized. And he heard there was this one prostitute who's all the way at the edge of the world, who charges a hefty sum. And he says, I'm going to go there. And he travels, and he has to go through 7 rivers. And finally he gets there, and he meets the prostitute. And after they're done, there's a little bit of a bizarre episode where she has an emission of sorts. And she tells him, she gives him musar. She tells him, just like that's not going back to its source, you, Eliezer ben Durdai, you're not going back to your source. And you hit rock bottom when a prostitute starts giving you reprimandations. So he gets all awakened, like, what am I doing with my life? What am I living for? What's my purpose? And he starts praying, and he starts to see, very interesting what happens to him. Eventually, he just breaks down, and he repents, and he's so filled with remorse that he actually dies. And when he dies, the same thing happens. There's this bat kol, this very low-level prophecy that announces Rabbi Eliezer ben Dudai is welcomed, is ushered into Olam Haba. And of course, Rabbi Judah the Prince, when he hears the story, same thing, he starts crying. Some people have to spend their whole life to achieve their world, and some people achieve the world in an hour. That's story number 2. And the last story, a very similar story. It's told of Rabbi Hanina ben Tradian, also from that era. He was a victim of the Roman Shmad. The Shmad was the effort of the Romans to destroy Jewish leadership by banning Torah and banning mitzvahs. So they said, he can't study Torah, and he was still teaching Torah. So Rabbi Hanina ben Tradian was teaching Torah. And the Romans came and they captured him while he was in the middle of teaching. He was teaching from a Torah scroll. They grab him, they seize him, and they seize the Torah scroll. And then bring him outside, and then they make a public display of this execution of this great venerated sage. They take him, they wrap him up in the Torah scroll, the actual Torah scroll, and they light it on fire. Obviously, Romans were brutal in ways that are barbaric and unimaginable. So, and now to augment his suffering, they actually take a ball of wool, they dunk it in water, and they place it on his heart so he shouldn't expire. And it's a very, very interesting discussion of what's happening here. For example, his daughter is there, and she's obviously watching her father being tortured and killed in this most horrific way. And she tells him, I can't believe I'm seeing you like this. It's so disastrous. And he tells her like this, just an amazing line what he tells her. He says, if I was being burned myself, I would say, okay, who knows what's going to be with me. But now that I'm being burned with a Torah scroll, I know the Almighty is not going to be silent and allow His Torah to be defamed in such an egregious manner. And I know that once He is going to come and try to exact reparations for the Torah's shame, He'll already take care of me as well. Interesting. And there are students there, and the students are watching, obviously. Can you imagine an experience like this? Unbelievable. And the students are telling him, and they ask him, what do you see? Which is an interesting question. It's like, of all the questions to ask, right? But a student is someone who's always trying to study, is always trying to learn. What's the lesson? What do you see here? And he tells him these words that are just very emotional, but also very emblematic of the Jewish response to tragedy. He tells him, I see that the parchment is being burned, but the letters of the Torah scroll are flying up to heaven. But he's telling them, I see the Torah is being burned, but the core content of the Torah is inexhaustible. You can't destroy the Jewish soul, the Jewish spirit, the Torah itself. Yeah, you could burn the parchment, so to speak, of the Torah, but the Torah itself, right, that's eternal.
Because every letter has meaning.
Every letter has meaning, but the Torah itself, the spiritual reality of the Torah is it cannot be destroyed. Fine. Another question they asked him is that they say to him, why don't you just open up your mouth to expedite your death? So he tells them also very interesting. He tells them, the Almighty gave me the soul. If He wants to take it, let Him come take it. I'm not going to expedite it. Very interesting. So all these things are happening, and the Roman executioner is there as well. And he's inspired by everything that the rabbi is saying. And he asked the rabbi a question. He says, if I expedite your execution, will you guarantee me a portion of the world to come? So he tells him yes. Quickly, he raises the fire. He pulls off the wool. Immediately, Rabbi Hanina ben Tradian passes away. And not only that, the executioner jumps into the fire as well, and he dies. And after that happened, once again, we get the bat kol, this low-level prophecy that announces Rabbi Hanina ben Tradian, the great rabbi, and the Kalstan Tanuri, which is the executioner, Both of them are ushered into the world to come. And like the previous two episodes, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, when he hears the story, he starts crying, and he says, some people have to spend their whole lives, many, many years, trying to achieve Olam Haba, and some people get it in 1 hour. These are the stories. And this illuminates this idea that there is a shortcut. It doesn't have to be a grind, day after day, year after year, to get Olam Haba, building it limb by limb, brick by brick. Rather, you could just jump all in, and you have Olam Haba in 1 hour. And you notice that Rabbi Judah the Prince, he starts crying, and he says, some people worked so hard to achieve this over multiple years, and some people achieved the same thing in 1 hour. And I think the idea is like this. The idea is that when we do a mitzvah, we're consecrating our limb, so to speak, to God. And thus, we achieve a spiritual limb that corresponds to the mitzvah. And thus, after many years of doing many mitzvahs, we could actually complete this avatar of our spiritual reality. But in each one of these three stories, the hero of the story didn't go limb by limb, brick by brick, and building who they are spiritually. Instead, they just jumped in all at once. They dedicated the entirety of their lives to God. And you notice all three episodes, the hero died. Because what he did is he gave up his life for God. It wasn't like he gave up one limb at a time. He did it all at once. And thus there's no way for him to do it without dying. So the spiritual shortcut is also a little bit of a task or something to ask for us, because the idea is to give up everything to God instead of giving up a little bit at a time.
But you're just giving up your pre-life.
Of course. And that's why, by the way, in Jewish history, the great heroes are the ones that give up lives for God. And that's why, there's this idea that we have to be ready for opportunities to dedicate not just a little bit of ourselves to God, but everything. And I want to make this a little bit easier. I feel like I made your life harder so far. Let's make it a little bit easier. Relatively. So there's a story here with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is an example, if you just met this person, or if you just studied his books, or if you just read his life story, you'd be convinced that Torah is divine. You don't need to have any very fancy polemics to discover that Torah is divine, because you see someone that doesn't play by the rules, so to speak. Any human fallacy that we're used to seeing by everyone, any human drawbacks, the bad midos that are commonplace, he had none of them. Someone who was just kindness, just dedication to mission, zero pursuit of honor, someone who spent his whole life studying Torah. It's unbelievable. Like, you see how the Torah can take someone who was born, like we all are, with shortcomings, and just purify it. Like, it's alchemy. It's taking something common and turning it into gold. That's what the Torah is. And you just look at the Torah giants, the Torah greats, and see, and the closer you get to them, the more you see how perfect they made themselves. It's usually the opposite. Usually, if you actually met a celebrity, it's sometimes very disappointing, because the way they're presented and the way they actually behave is vastly different. Yeah, you met him, ooh, such a bad guy. Ugh, like you want to be friends. Like it's disappointing because your hero is now someone that you look down upon. With Torah giants, the closer you get to know them, the more you discover about their great character and the tremendous midos and their selflessness and the dedication to mission. So this Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the hero of the next story, is someone who is like that. So there's a story with him. So he's in the 20th century, arguably the greatest halachic authority of the 20th century. He's someone who you read the stories about him, and it sounds superlatives, right? It's just unbelievable. He would study, for example, this is just an example, on every Shabbos, he would study the book of Shabbos, the Talmud tractate of Shabbos, every Shabbos. Now, what does that mean? It's 156 pages. 156 pages of Talmud. If we tried to study the book of, us together as a group, try to study the book of Shabbos, it would take us probably 10 years. He did it every Shabbos. Unbelievable.
The whole book.
The whole book, yeah.
He never slept.
He just never stopped studying. He slept, but he was just so dedicated. His responsa, where he writes a Torah response on every question in the world, he's able to bring dozens of sources from all across the Talmud, both Talmuds, knows 1,000 years of Jewish judicial ideas and positions by heart. Unbelievable stuff. Now, he once wrote a halachic opinion, and someone, a Torah scholar of much minor pedigree, wrote a response to it that not only argued with him, which is okay, but belittled him, which is not okay. Someone who is unquestionably the greatest Torah scholar of his time, you have to have some modicum of respect for him. You could argue with the Torah, that's fair game. Fine, to this guy, that's what he did. Okay. Not everyone's going to be someone who's going to behave the way they should. A few months later, Rabbi Feinstein gets a knock on his door, and who's there? That same guy who embarrassed him a few months prior. So everyone in the house assumed that he came to apologize. Right? If you, God forbid, you were to embarrass the Gadol Hador, the greatest man of the generation, the first thing you wouldn't do, you would go there and apologize and have regret and go there. Right? Fine, that's what everyone assumes. He comes in and he says, "Oh, Rabbi Feinstein, I wrote a new book, and it's traditional. When you write a new halachic book, you get a letter of recommendation from the Gadol Hador, from the greatest of the generation, the authorities. So I wonder if you could write me a letter." Can you imagine the incredulity of the people? This guy who previously had spoken negatively about Moshe, he's coming now to ask for a haskama, ask for a letter of recommendation, for an approbation. People don't believe their eyes. And Rabbi Feinstein pulls out his letterhead and starts writing for the guy. And writes him, he's such a wonderful guy, and a Torah scholar, and has fear of heaven. The people can't believe it. What's going on? He gives the letter, he doesn't apologize, and he leaves. So the students asked him, what's going on over here? So Rabbi Feinstein tells him like this. He tells him, the Gemara tells us, and he quotes our Gemaras, it's possible to achieve Olam Haba in 1 hour. I thought perhaps this was my opportunity to do that. Every fiber of my being, my own personal feelings, what's justified is telling me to tell the guy, get lost. That's what's right. But I have an opportunity to overcome every bit of resistance and do something that's wrong. But do something which is such an act of dedication that maybe I can achieve, maybe I can forgive the guy and forgive the evil that he did. And just do something just because maybe this is a spiritual opportunity.
Did he read it first?
Well, he read it. I'm sure he read parts of it. He read parts of it. That's what they do. Whenever Rabbi Feinstein would give an approbation, he would say, listen, I'm not giving approbation to every single idea that's written here because I haven't read. But this guy's a good guy, and he's a great scholar, and I've read some pieces, and I've liked what I've read, and that's all of his approbations. He would do that. That's the tradition also. And to me, this really opens up the door to a new idea, and that is that in life we're going to have opportunities to achieve spiritual greatness in ways that are not common. Someone does something wrong to you, right? and you're justified. You're right. You're actually right. And that person's wrong. And you feel like you take the moral high ground, right? Right. I'm right. They're wrong. Let them apologize to me. what happens if you go over to that person and say, you know what, I apologize for what I did. I was wrong and I shouldn't have done it. And your heart's aching. How could I say that? That's not true. But you know what? What's going to happen now? You're going to bring that person to say, well, I wasn't so right myself, right? And I really appreciate you coming to say, well, apologize. And now you'll be good. You'll be friends, and peace and friendship will ensue. You have an opportunity to jump the rungs of the ladder of greatness in a way that's uncommon. You could achieve your world, so to speak. I don't know if it's your whole world, it's part of your world, but you could do a lot. It's a spiritual opportunity that doesn't come around all the time. It's a once, perhaps in a lifetime, perhaps once in a generation, perhaps once in a decade. You get an opportunity like that to do something great, and you have to be ready to seize it. A couple of weeks ago, there was a commencement address. Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, he spoke at Yeshiva University. Yeshiva University is a yeshiva and a university morphed together. So Robert Kraft, he grew up observant, and he's telling all these stories about his dad who took him to shul and what they studied. But in his address, he says, a very interesting idea. He says, when the Patriots, the football team, they were up for sale, so he wanted to buy it. The team was being mismanaged, and he was a local New England businessman. He was a season ticket holder. He wanted to buy it. And he said that the team was worth about $112 million. And he said he was willing to go up to 115, maybe 120. 122 was his max. And the owner said, I'm selling it for $172 million, not a penny less. And he said like this. He said that I went to business school, and there are some things, some opportunities that don't come up in business school, and they're once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and you have to just follow your gut and just do it and not think about it. Because if you do the numbers, it was a bad deal. But sometimes in life, there's opportunities that are there, and they're uncommon, and you're not used to it, and you're not ready for it. You have to seize it. That's what he said in the business perspective. I think it's a good business perspective. Sometimes you have to just go for it. But I think we could take that and learn a spiritual component to that as well. Sometimes there are going to be spiritual opportunities that are uncommon, that you don't learn about it in your Jewish studies. It's not like one that you're ready for, but it's an opportunity to achieve a lot very fast and very dramatically. And I think that Rabbi Feinstein is telling us that this idea of achieving your whole world in 1 hour, it's possible in smaller doses as well. It doesn't mean you have to give up your life. It means that there are opportunities in life where you're going to be presented with a chance to do something out of this world, to overcome what you're feeling, and to really seize that opportunity. I have an example, which is, someone comes to you and tells you, I have this kid, they're not doing so well in school. They're dabbling with things they shouldn't be dabbling with. Could you help them find a job? So off the top of your head, you're like, well, I can't hire them. I don't need anyone. Maybe I'll text a friend of mine and see if they need someone. But if this was your child, you'd be up all night, right, worrying about them. And who knows if you get this kid back on track, what's going to be with them? Is it possible that they're at a critical juncture in their lives that they could go either way? They could be a productive human being, dare I say a productive Jew, who has a nice family, who is a contributor to the community, or they could just go down a path where they're just unproductive humans. And maybe this is a critical juncture, and you, working really hard to find this guy a job and to mentor them, can change their lives. That's an opportunity. And we think of it, what a nuisance. I got to call people. It's a nuisance, right? But you, right now, perhaps have an opportunity to change the world, or certainly this child's world. Will you seize that opportunity or not? Are you primed? Are you ready to jump at this chance to do something great? My my grandfather of blessed memory, the original Rabbi Wolbe, he's the one who messed up my Google results, because when you search Rabbi Wolbe, you find him. So you read about him. I would advise you to read about him, but he was a tremendous Torah scholar, of course. He founded many yeshivas. He has a very remarkable life story, but there's one particular episode in his life, not very well known, but he really did this, and I'll tell you what happened. So he was during the war, during World War II, he was in Sweden, in Stockholm. He managed to get there. It was a miracle how he ended up there, because he was in Poland, and he was a German national, so how he stayed out of Poland. He ended up in safety in neutral Sweden. Now, when he was there, he was indispensable towards a lot of the efforts to help Jews in war-torn Europe, for example. He managed to procure passports, hundreds of passports, for yeshiva students, and hundreds of visas that allowed many of them to escape the inferno that was Europe. So that's one story. Other stories as well. But either way, the war was over, and my grandfather read in a newspaper that there was trains of refugees, of displaced people, that was arriving in Sweden. And he said, maybe these are Jews. Who knows? Maybe there's some people here that need help. So he said, I'm going to go see what's going on. He went to the refugee camp. Turns out that the Swedish government was having a problem. The problem was that there was a mismatch in the amount of eligible young men and women. There were more men than there were women. So they figured that they're going to allow some young Jewish girls, under the guise of being helpful, of being humanitarianistic, they're going to bring them into Sweden. These are refugees, and then they'll get acculturated, and then they'll help us with they'll intermarry and they'll be gone for the Jewish people. And they only allowed women. That's why so they allowed 20,000 Jewish women to come to Sweden. And so my grandfather gets to this camp and he sees all these Jewish girls. But these are Jewish girls that went through 4 or 5 years of trauma, of camps, of starvation camps, of work camps. And he says, oh my gosh, what do we do? He's like, just obviously it's very emotional to see all this pain and suffering. He's trying to talk to see what's going on. So he, in the course of his day there, he hears a bell. They're ringing a bell. What's the bell? Lunchtime. Okay, he brought his lunch as well. So he takes out his sandwich that he prepared, and he's looking for something. So the girls ask him, what are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for a place to wash my hands. So the girls are taken back a little bit. And then he goes and he washes his hands, and he makes a bracha, and he turns around and he sees all the girls crying. These were great Jewish girls from great Jewish families that just were brought back to life before the tragedy that destroyed their lives. And they all started crying. And they see this rabbi with a big beard who's washing his hands, who's making a blessing, and they start saying, oh gosh, and they all start crying. And they say, Tati, they remember their father? And my grandfather said he himself started crying. Like, it's so emotional. And they're here in Sweden. What's going to be with these girls? That's what happens. He's going back, and he's going back to Stockholm, and he's trying to figure out what to do. And then on the train, he's like, the only solution here is to open up a school for these girls. And he said he was inspired to try to do something about it. He says, the second he was inspired, he got off the train, and he went to the train stop. He sent a telegraph back to Sweden, back to Stockholm, to gather all the people of the community. We have to have a meeting tonight to discuss this problem. He gets back to Stockholm. They have a meeting. At the meeting, they decide the only solution is to try to open a school for these girls. How do you open a school in Sweden? What are you going to do? Yeah, the funds are very, very in short supply. So he says, we have to do what we can. And they told him, if you get us a building to have a school, we'll help fund the rest of the operation. So they sent a bunch of letters to the Swedish Ministry of the Interior. And he knew he's like, this is all for naught. What are they going to say? Give us a school, a building for a Jewish school in Stockholm? What are you, nuts? We have to do what we can. He writes a letter, explains the situation. Can you give us a building? Shockingly, he gets back the response, how many buildings do you need? We'll start with one. And right then and there, they founded a school in a little island right next to Stockholm, a place called Lidingö.
Say that again?
Lidingö. It was a school. And they had hundreds of Jewish girls come to the school to reintroduce them to their faith, bring them back to Judaism. And indeed, many of those women went on to very successful lives, most of them in Israel, some in the United States, where they each built a beautiful family, and there's probably right now, I would say, tens of thousands of Jewish descendants that wouldn't have been if not for the efforts of my grandfather.
How many stayed in Sweden?
Well, I'm saying there was thousands of girls. Who knows what happened to them? I'm sure that, there's actually a book written, if you want to read about this wonderful, inspiring story of the girls of Lidingö, Lidingo.
So what the government hoped for was for them to assimilate. Didn't happen.
Oh, it didn't happen. Well, some of them did, of course,
Yeah.
but... So that's the story. And to me, this really it demonstrates how, okay, we have problems. There's a problem. There's 20,000 girls here, and what's going to be with them? And, I think we look at my grandfather and his heroism. He's someone who said, I'm going to try. Do I know, will my efforts be successful? Who knows? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I'm going to try to do my best to try to do, to at least give an effort to try to be successful, to try to do something about this.
200.
What does it say, 200?
200.
200 girls?
Yeah. So that's what I got so far. Yeah.
I actually have a picture here. My grandfather would, he would.
Even one would be good, but
There's a picture of it. My grandfather is, you see the picture? My grandfather is there, he's teaching. He would come in once a week to teach, because they had their own teachers there. But he started the school, so he would teach once a week. So here's a picture of him teaching there.
They thought the schools, the clothing, the food, the medical care.
Everything.
that goes with it. It's not just his opinion.
Actually, incidentally, my grandmother was one of the teachers in the school. That's how my grandparents met. So we could safely say that I'm a product of this heroism as well.
So was your grandmother Swedish?
No, she was from one of the most illustrious families of pre-war European, Jewish aristocracy, if you will. Her father was the head of one of the great yeshivas in all of Europe. But like many of her peers, she was in the war, and she even said, she wrote this in her book, she wrote a book about this, she even said that throughout the years, she forgot basic prayers, like how to say basic prayers. And she said the only thing that gave her comfort was when she heard of a great yeshiva student who also, throughout the years of torture and abuse, forgot basic prayers. But it's unbelievable, It's what was the Jewish people were torn to shreds. There was, and they're survivors. But were they survivors in name only? Because their life was forever altered. And there were people that made it their business to try to help these Jews and save these Jews and bring them back to the fold.
What's interesting is that he did not let time get away from him. So much of the time we'll say, I'm going to get to that. I'm guilty of saying, I'm going to get to that. But to call a meeting that night.
Well, and he even said, when he was inspired, he got off the train right then. I'm going to try to do whatever I can right now, as soon as I can, to not let the inspiration dissipate. And we know there are people during the war that didn't stop for a second to try to help people. Those are the people that saw this opportunity, this to get it all in 1 second, to get it all in 1 hour, one act of heroism, like that could really cement your legacy. Of course, we don't stop cementing our legacy. We try to create a grander legacy as well.
Whatever happened to the school?
The school continued for a couple of years, but once the State of Israel was founded, everyone just went to Israel. There's this interim period after the war where immigration was still very hard to come by. The British white paper was still in effect, very, very minimal. My grandfather actually got to Israel before the war, before the independence. How he got to Israel is another great story. I'll tell you guys a story once we were here. So my grandmother came from a very, very illustrious family. My grandfather came from the opposite. His family was from Berlin. Berlin was a very assimilated community. He ended up in yeshiva in Poland, but still, he was a no-namer. And when him and my grandmother decided they wanted to get married, the people who knew my grandmother's family, they're like, what's going to be like this, this prized jewel of the Jewish people is going to marry some Swedish rabbi? What's going to be? So they quickly found a way to get her to Israel, to sneak her away. And my grandfather said he decided that he's not going to try to get engaged before then. If the Almighty wants it to happen, it'll happen. If not, not. So my grandmother got to Israel, and she was talking to some of the people there who tried to usher her away, and they realized that my grandfather was really someone special, and they said, okay, well, let's get him over here as well. How are you going to get him over here? You got to convince the British to allow him to come. So what they did was like this. They told the British, after the war, there's a big problem because many Jewish families were separated. And thus you have many women who don't know if their husband's alive or not. And if their husband's alive, they can't get remarried, of course. And if husband's dead, of course, they can get remarried. So there's a lot of issues you have to resolve. And Rabbi Wolbe, my grandfather, he was in Sweden. He was involved with a lot of these issues. He knew a lot of people. Let's bring him here so he could help us trying to help as many women as possible to find out if their husband is dead and they can remarry or not, and then try to connect those dots. That was the argument made that the British bought it, and he came to Israel in 1946, or 47, I don't know exactly when he came, and they got married, and my dad was born in 1953.
There's a book on it.
Yes, there was a book, very dramatic. She was I think she was one of the students. Either way, I think this is an idea that we have to try to harbor and inculcate in ourselves. In life, there's going to be opportunities to do a lot very fast. Usually, it's a grind. Mitzvahs are hard. We cannot neglect any mitzvah, because every mitzvah is important, just like every limb is important. But we have to be ready to seize a otherworldly opportunity if it is presented to us. It's not going to be easy. But if we're aware, we're ready to seize it, just like Robert Kraft says, sometimes there'll be business opportunities that don't come and you can't learn about them prior. They don't come often. You can't learn about them prior, and you have to just jump in with both feet. These stories from the Talmud, these stories from people that we know or we knew, demonstrate to us that maybe it's not quite saving hundreds of girls. Maybe it's not quite helping someone in a way that we cannot telegraph how it's going to come, but we're going to all have opportunities to do that. Maybe it's forgiving someone that did something wrong to you. And you're right and they're wrong. You're right. But to say that, to apologize to them, this is something I think that's maybe more common. To apologize to them and to make amends and to really say, I regret what I did, even though you know you're right, but were you completely right? Is there a little bit of blame to be passed around? Probably. And do that, and let's see what happens. See if we could mend bridges. Who knows how many divorces could be avoided if people had this attitude of, I'm going to apologize even when I'm right, or mostly right. But when you do that, you bring peace, you bring love back to the Jewish people, you help mend relationships, and that is what the Almighty wants of us. And that is an opportunity to jump the rungs. And I would say that that's another path towards achieving Olam Haba, wherein we're able to do something that demands every limb of ours to be dedicated to God.
Did you know your grandfather? He died
Yes,
before
he died in 2005. I was 18. I was close to him.
Were he died?
He was old. The Almighty wanted his soul back.
So once you get this passport to the,
Olam Haba, yes.
can you do something really bad to have it taken away?
Yeah, well, every Jew is born with a golden ticket. Some people are born with a silver spoon. We're born with a golden ticket. That's because by dint of who we are and what we stand for, and what our mission is, we are people that are dedicating our lives towards God. That's what it means to be a Jew. So we're already there. We can undo that if we so choose. An example being, the Rambam enumerates 24 sins that make someone lose their portion in the world to come. One of them is when someone does a circumcision reversal surgery. And that is because the circumcision represents the Jewish mission towards changing the world. When someone says, I don't want that, okay, you're opting out, okay, so then you have to earn it on your own. Thus, your identity alone cannot guarantee you that golden ticket.
So if a child dies, that child has his golden ticket.
Yes.
Has not had a chance to...
Yes, absolutely. The Gemara says that even a child that dies is a miscarriage. Even a miscarriage. The child dies in utero or at 3 months or whatever, even that child has a portion will to come.
I
Yeah.
wondered about that earlier when we
Yes.
were talking. I wonder what happens to children.
That's right, which gives a little bit of meaning to suffering to know that even that's not in vain.
Also, the child that's born with deformities, unfortunately, that child has a portion of the...
Oh, yeah,
because
absolutely, absolutely.
He's here now as he is.
Of course. That's why every life is precious. Because the physical iteration of ourselves could be imperfect, but that does not infringe upon our spirituality that can be perfect as well. Okay, so we have these two paths. We have path number one, let's do all the mitzvahs fastidiously and let's achieve perfection, just like we have this, we have this connection to every part of our physical body. Let's try to not neglect every part of our spiritual body as well. Do mitzvahs perfectly. You do all of them perfectly, your guaranteed portion will to come. Good. We have this other method wherein we do one mitzvah or one act of dedication that envelops our entirety of our existence, and we achieve that same thing in 1 hour because we dedicate our whole lives all at once, not brick by brick, indeed all in one instance. Is there another path? So the Talmud tells us, very interesting statement of the Talmud that may sound indeed contradictory to some things that we're told elsewhere in the Talmud. And that is as follows. Rabbi Hanina says, Rabbi Hanina bar Kasha Omer, the Almighty sought to benefit the Jewish people, therefore He increased for them Torah and mitzvahs. We have so much Torah, so much mitzvahs. That's because the Almighty loves us. Now, we know that a mitzvah is a responsibility as well as being an opportunity. So more mitzvahs, while it means more opportunities, it also means more responsibilities, more opportunities for failure as well. So which one is it? So Talmud tells us over here that, well, more mitzvahs is more opportunities. But why is that all beneficial for us? Why? They might have sought to benefit the Jewish people. Therefore, give us a lot of mitzvahs. Well, it's a benefit, but it's also a drawback because now there's more opportunities for failure. So there's a very interesting Rambam here. The Rambam tells us, on the commentary on this Mishnah, very interesting idea. It is a fundamental principle of our faith that when a person does one of the 613 mitzvahs properly, and does it with absolutely no external intentions, rather for its sake and out of love of God, he will merit through it to the eternal life, to Olam Haba. What he's telling us is like this. Mitzvahs, you can do a lot of mitzvahs. There's the quantitative aspect of the mitzvahs, and then there's the qualitative aspect of the mitzvahs as well. It's possible to do a mitzvah and say, well, I'm going to donate a lot of money to the synagogue, but then they'll put a big name, the Walby Center. Right? And that's also nice. Or even if they don't put the name, but everyone's like, hey, buddy, thanks, it's really nice. And like you walk around and everyone sees your contribution. And then you could do a mitzvah with no one knowing about it. And you're not getting anything out of it, you're doing it just for God. And you deliberately try to cover it up. Can you imagine doing a mitzvah like that? And we feel an urge to tell people about it. Hey, you see that thing? I helped, Someone told me recently, he's like, I told him, we spoke about this Sunday school. He's like, paid for it? You're looking at him. Right? Which is we feel an urge to try to gain recognition for our mitzvahs. But what happens when you do a mitzvah and you don't let anyone know about it? No one knows about it. It's anonymous. And you're doing it just because you love the Almighty. You want to do what's right. That's a mitzvah that's lacking nothing. It's done perfectly. When you do such a mitzvah, says the Rambam, you gain access to Olam Haba. One mitzvah, done what's called lishma perfectly. Thus, says Rechoni Kashya, the Almighty wanted to benefit us. Therefore, give us so many mitzvahs. Because there's so many mitzvahs, and therefore, invariably, over the course of our lives, hopefully we'll do at least one of those mitzvahs perfectly. We have hundreds of opportunities to do mitzvahs every day. Let's do one of them perfectly. At least one of them perfectly. But there's so many of them, that's a benefit to us, because hopefully we'll do at least one of those perfectly. And by that, we'll get Olam Haba. So here we have 248 mitzvahs, positive. 365 mitzvahs, negative. Doing them all, we achieve perfection. We're in Olam Haba. We have this other idea of dedicating the entirety of our lives to God, doing something that demands every fiber of our existence, Olam Haba. Now we have another opportunity. Not to do them all, to do one, once, and do it perfectly. Now, to be clear, quick disclaimer. If you actually look at the wording of these two sources, it's clear that when someone does all the mitzvahs and they actually build that spiritual avatar of themselves, then they're what's called a ben Olam Haba. Then they are a citizen of Olam Haba. They're a citizen of the spiritual world. As opposed to when someone does one mitzvah perfectly, they have a portion of the world to come, which means that they're there, but they got in a loophole, or maybe their status there is different. But at least you got there, which is a tremendous achievement. But it wouldn't be as great as the other ways. But one mitzvah, doing it properly, doing it without any other ulterior motives, gains you something that you cannot possibly achieve any other way. Now, the way I like to explain this is as follows. If you remember, we spoke about like an hour and a half ago, the idea of getting reward for your mitzvahs in this world versus the next. If someone is a wicked person, they do loads and loads of sins, but they also sprinkle in a few mitzvahs as well. What happens to those few mitzvahs that they sprinkle in? Obviously, they're very minor compared to the volume, the aggregate of their behavior of sins. But those have to be accounted for. Remember, the Almighty accounts for everything.
So you have a balance sheet.
Well, the Almighty has the balance sheet. We don't keep track, right? But they might keep track of everything. So those mitzvahs, they can gain reward for those mitzvahs in this world. Now, why is it fair that two people do a mitzvah and one person gets reward here and one person gets reward in Olam Haba? Doesn't seem fair. Well, the answer is that there's self-selection. So if you're a righteous person, you're living your life for a grander purpose. You're living not just for this pre-life stuff. You want to live for the real existence, for Olam Haba. Well, okay, you're prioritizing Olam Haba, so you are prioritizing that location, that venue, for your reward. So you get your reward. You're asking for a reward in Olam Haba. Sure, the Almighty acquiesces. When someone who prioritizes this world and only lives for this world and deprioritizes Olam Haba, so he's saying he wants his reward over here. So the Almighty capitulates and gives him a reward over here. The point is that we self-select where we want our reward and punishment. In fact, the Talmud goes to say that the righteous people select their punishment in this world. So ironically, punishment for the righteous in this world is beneficial for them, which, as crazy as that sounds. But either way, how is it possible to give imperfect worldly reward for a mitzvah? A mitzvah is a spiritual deed. How is it possible to pay someone for a spiritual deed in passing currency, so to speak? Someone gets rewarded in this world. How long does that last? Maybe 100 years, 120 years. That's the maximum. You did a mitzvah. How is it possible to be paid in this? The answer is, the reason why it's possible to give imperfect reward for a mitzvah is because the mitzvah itself was also imperfect. You do a mitzvah imperfectly, thus it's possible to be rewarded for that mitzvah also imperfectly. Thus, it's possible to be rewarded for your mitzvah in this world. When someone does a mitzvah perfectly, it's lacking nothing. It's a totally spiritual deed. A totally spiritual deed must be recompensed in a totally spiritual world. Thus, if you do a mitzvah, one mitzvah lishma perfectly, there's no other way for this to play out other than you get a portion of what to come. There's no other way to do it. And I think the lesson from this is that we have to be attuned not just to the volume of mitzvahs, how many mitzvahs to do and do them, but to also try to find a way to do mitzvahs to raise our sensitivity to doing a mitzvah perfectly. To focus on ridding ourselves of any ulterior purposes for the mitzvah as well. To deliberately try to conceal the mitzvah. You know how hard that is? Because we have to rework our compass, so to speak, of what we're trying to achieve in life. We love when people say, hey, good job, buddy. Oh wow, this guy is so righteous. Whew! What a wonderful guy. What an asset to the community. That's what we're used to trying to strive to get. And now we're being told, try to deliberately conceal it, and that way you do it for its spiritual reasons, and thus it cannot be fulfilled. It cannot be rewarded for in a physical world. If it's an entirely spiritual activity, it can only be fulfilled, the account be settled in an entirely spiritualistic realm.
Like virtue is its own reward.
Well, no. We don't look at virtue as being its own reward, because then you could do all the mitzvahs in the world and actually you're just like we said, kicking the can down the road. The virtue is manifested in something beyond that. Now, to be clear, I don't want to talk about how that works, because it might actually work. Like you said, if you do a mitzvah, you create that spiritual counterpart that is in itself its reward. So you are kind of right, but the way it's presented is a little bit different, right? You do a mitzvah, you create a spiritual, so to speak, limb that is who you are for Olam Haba. So virtue is indeed its own reward, because you're creating that reality that's going to give you vitality for Olam Haba. But to say that virtue itself is its own reward and that is limited to the virtue itself is so I'm saying you're right, and this idea is correct, but the way it's presented is incorrect. The way it's presented is like, okay, that itself is reward. No, well then you have no reward. But that in itself creates the reality, which is the reward, is true. So it's a little bit of how you present it. The semantics are important.
If I do a mitzvah and I want to keep it secret, I want to do it just for the sake of heaven, I place in the world to come.
Yes.
Have I negated it because that is my motive for doing it? Can I even have that as a motive?
So the Rambam tells us, that's a little tricky, right? So the Rambam tells us, so this is a big question. The Rambam tells us that that too would be an ulterior motive. But it's not so clear from the sources, because is having a spiritual motive not spiritual? So he says yes.
Yes, you negate it.
You don't negate it. We don't negate anything, but it does curtail it a little bit.
It brings it down a level.
It brings it down a level. That being said, I think that if we're ever going to strive to doing a mitzvah totally altruistically, only for God, and not even thinking about the reward, let's at least start with just thinking about spiritual reward. And then we'll get to there when we get to there.
Is there anything that doesn't have anything that we
Yes,
do
it's hard for us to imagine that, but it is possible. In fact, there's a great story about the going to Vilna. It's a great story. Every year, the community in Vilna would acquire for him the best, most pristine etrog for the holiday of Sukkot. And there was one year where the esrogs were hard to come by, and there was only one guy in town that had a perfect esrog. And the community leaders came to him and said, listen, we have a tradition to give the Gaon of Vilna, to give him the most beautiful esrog. Do you mind relinquishing your esrog and giving it to him? So he said like this. He told the messenger, he says, listen, I am willing to give my esrog to the Gaon of Vilna, to the great rabbi. But on condition that he relinquishes his Olam Haba that he gets for this mitzvah to me. I'll give it to him, but he gives me the reward. Puzzled by this, they go back to the rabbi and they tell him, this is what the guy said. Right? Can you imagine? He wants to hijack the rabbi's reward. And the Gaon of Vilna jumps out of the seat. I'm so excited. Tell him yes. Finally, I could do a mitzvah, and I'm guaranteed I'm doing it just lishma. Just for its sake. We're not quite there yet. Let's try to start. But it's a good question.
Into itself,
right.
know.
Let if we keep our motives spiritual, we're good from where we're holding. Either way, in conclusion, I think there are a lot of lessons here. I think lesson number one is the importance of every mitzvah, to not cast aside as unimportant even the most minor of mitzvahs. We have to pursue even the most minor mitzvahs as intensely as we pursue the more important mitzvahs, or the relatively more important mitzvah. Just like we don't say, my toe, who needs my toe? What do you mean? You know how good they make these prosthetic limbs today? Yeah. No one says that. And we value every part of who we are. The mitzvahs create who we are in a spiritual sense. The idea of a spiritual opportunity that comes once in a lifetime, like Robert Kraft told us. Sometimes you're presented with an opportunity that you cannot get tomorrow. And it's once in a decade, once in a generation, maybe even once in a lifetime. Seize it. Be ready to do that, even though it may mean a lot of self-determination and dedication.
When you were talking about that earlier, I thought of the story of Queen Esther, where that opportunity came to her.
Yeah, of course. And that's what Mordechai tells her.
Yeah.
Who knows? This is your opportunity. Yeah. It all comes to this. And are you going to do it? The Jewish people will survive.
Yeah, but you won't.
Exactly. You're going to. That's right. And lastly, let us try to focus on trying to do mitzvahs, our individual mitzvahs, to do them with a high degree of purity and dedication to mission, because by doing that, we shed it of its worldly, earthly elements, and by doing that, hopefully, we can achieve a portion of what to come. I thank you all and look forward to next time. This was a lot of fun. I'm happy we selected this subject. It was wonderful.
It was great.
I just thought something. Sometimes you might do the mitzvah for your own intent to help somebody else or whatever, but then other people see you do it. But your goal wasn't to have other people see you, so it's the same.
It's interesting that we find stories of the great leaders and the great heroes of Jewish people that deliberately tried to conceal their mitzvahs.
I mean, you might,
which some we're not used to doing.
But you could give money or food or something to somebody that needs it, but you're not saying you're just doing it for the sake of that person.
Yeah.
On the other hand,
If someone
somebody
sees
will
it, so what?
witness you giving food or something to somebody else,
And that's okay. That's okay.
but you did it for your own personal
That's okay.
love, mitzvah, or wanting to help, so it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Anything you do good is gonna